Charlemagne, Karl der Große, founder of the Carolingian Empire, the father of Europe, or just Charlie. But what about the Charlemagne of Fate Grand Order? How well does he compare to his historical and mythical counterpart? And what grade would I give his depiction? Let's find out. Before going any further, not only will this video spoil the events of Lost Build 6.5, Traum, but it will also get into the events of the game Fate EXTELLA LINK. Now with that said, let's continue. Charlemagne is a Saber class servant, and a ruler class servant in Fate EXTELLA LINK called Karl der Große, or Rex Magnus Karl, though that name is a bit weird. His name is Charles the Great in English, Charlemagne in French, Karl der Große in German, and Carolus Magnus Rex in Latin. I've not seen the name Rex Magnus Karl outside of Fate EXTELLA LINK. In his lifetime, he would have been known as Karl, or Karl. More on this later. Charlemagne is a pretty interesting case as a servant, since he has two very different versions of his character based upon two different periods of his life. In his Saber version, you have the younger Charlemagne, the brash, impetuous, but good-hearted adventurer who had just become King of the Franks. In his ruler version, you have the older Charlemagne, the great state builder and the first emperor in Western Europe since the fall of Western Rome. It's similar to what you see in Li Xuan, with his younger lancer form and his older assassin form. In any case, are Saber and Ruler good class choices for Charlemagne? Absolutely. He is both a sword wielder and one of history's greatest state builders. Getting into his character design, much like how you see Charlemagne grow up from a Saber into a Ruler, the course of his ascension forms also follow the course of his life. In his first ascension, he is the adventurer, nothing too fancy, relatively light armor, and a small cape. When you move into his second ascension though, this is Charlemagne as the leader of his paladins, the warrior king constantly fighting back against the invading armies. The armor is much thicker and ornate, now having a full-length cape to go with it. This only becomes more pronounced in his third ascension, where he is starting to look a lot like his ruler self, with this ascension form kind of seeming like a transition between his Saber and ruler identities. Once you get to his ruler form from Fate EXTELLA LINK, it's pretty much all ostentation, with all that gold and the large hat which vaguely looks like a pope hat. Charlemagne obviously was never a pope, but he did fight extensively on behalf of the papacy. It was because of this service that he was crowned emperor in the year 800. One thing that is notable about Karl der Große's design are the crosses, the most obvious being the large one upon his chest, but he even has one on his beard. This actually is quite fitting, since many of the wars he fought during his life, particularly against the Saxons, focused upon converting his enemies to Christianity. He was very much trying to build a Christian empire to fill the void left by the Western Roman Empire, which had seen Western Europe devolve into rather violent anarchy until Charlemagne built his empire. A few more notes about his design. Charlemagne was quite tall for his time. Scientists analyzing his skeleton estimate that he was 6 feet tall, or 1.84 meters. I mean, that's still pretty tall today, but in the early medieval period, where malnutrition and famine were all too common, he would have been a giant. This is probably why his ruler form is so large, or at least it's one possible explanation. As for his appearance, Charlemagne is similar to King Arthur in the sense that depictions of Charlemagne tend to vary wildly. During his life, Charlemagne is noted as having kept his hair short, in contrast to his predecessors, while also sporting a mustache. But then in later times his appearance would change, getting not just a beard, but longer hair as well. This is not only how he is depicted in the legends such as the Song of Roland, but also in paintings. While the Saber Charlemagne has a fittingly youthful appearance, his ruler counterpart looks much more like his later depictions, that of a grand emperor with far more hair than his historical counterpart is said to have had, but is nevertheless how he ended up being portrayed over the centuries. At the very least, I can say that portraying Charlemagne's gradual shift from a young adventurer to a dignified monarch is quite fitting. I'll call this a good design. Moving into his skill set, Charlie's first skill is Kingship Traversal, which adds a 2-time invincibility for 3 turns to an ally of his choosing, as well as increasing his MP gain for 5 turns, and giving Charlemagne a status called Heroic King for 5 turns. Whenever Charlemagne is attacked while having this Heroic King status, it adds a stacking buff that lasts for 5 turns each time he is attacked, which becomes a key part of his MP, but this buff can only be applied if Charlemagne is not invincible. Lastly, if you use this skill while Charlemagne is invincible, Then this skill inflicts skill seal upon him for a turn. Damn, that's a lot. Seriously, Charlie is the first servant I've covered where I couldn't get his skill set all into a single screenshot. So what's the lore here? Well, this is meant to represent Charlemagne following the road to kingship, giving him bonuses when doing something kingly, like taking a hit for his allies, while punishing him for doing otherwise, like giving himself invulnerability. Or, as Charlie would put it, he gets buffs by doing something awesome, and debuffs for doing something lame. It is, at the very least, consistent with his character in-game. Charlemagne's second skill is Holy Knight Emperor, which increases attack for all allies for 3 turns, as well as giving himself special attack damage against demonic enemies and special defense against divine enemies, both for 3 turns. Also, it's an MP charge. This is a special charisma skill unique to Charlemagne, as the leader of the 12 paladins and eventually emperor of the Carolingian Empire. It also gives him buffs against demonic enemies and defenses against the divine, which is likely meant to symbolize Charlemagne's long history of waging conversion wars, particularly against the Saxons. Much like how I mentioned with the crosses on his design and his ruler form, Charlemagne sought to build a new Christian empire to try to fill the vacuum left behind by the fall of Western Rome. He wasn't particularly nice about it, but not many people were during that time period. You could argue that Charlemagne was a crusader, but centuries before crusades actually became a thing. A big reason for this depiction is that while Charlemagne existed centuries before the Crusades, the legends written about him were written during the Crusades, and so it often depicted Charlemagne as being like a crusader since that's what was going on during that time. Lastly, Chuck's third skill is Mana Burst Light, which increases his quick card, critical strength, and critical strength against evil enemies for 3 turns. Compared to his other skills, this is pretty straightforward. Mana Burst is something we have seen before, a large power boost caused by building up magical energy and then using it to attack. In Charlemagne's case, his Mana Burst is light, giving him an extra advantage against evil-aligned enemies. So far, he is the only character known to have this type of Mana Burst. It is reserved only for Saints, Holy Maidens, or Holy Knights, that last one being what Charlie would qualify as. This again relates to what I just mentioned regarding his second skill, how Charlemagne had a pretty extensive history of fighting wars against pagans and Muslims, often for the purpose of converting them to Christianity. While it might seem a bit lazy to have 2 skills relating to the same thing, it is a core part of what the historical Charlemagne did, and is arguably just as important in the legends that were written about him.
この見博せこそ天下無双の聖剣降臨するたび世を輝かせるものなりこの輝きで焼き尽くすジュワユーズ・オルドル
Charlemagne's noble phantasm is Joyeuse Order, whereupon he grows some wings, summons 12 weapons, 1 for each of his paladins, and then charges together with those swords to smite all of his foes. This MP does heavy damage to all enemies, with that damage increasing for each stack of the heroic king buff he has, up to a maximum of 12. This MP also decreases quick card resistance for all enemies for 3 turns, with the amount depending upon overcharge. In Fate EXTELLA Link, the visuals are pretty similar, but instead of charging in, he just uses the 12 blades to blast enemies from afar. So let's start with the name. Joyeuse is the name of Charlemagne's sword in legend, which means joyful in French, while Order is just order. So this MP in English is Joyful Order, and is meant to represent Charlemagne's bond with his 12 paladins, a key part of the legends written about him. This MP is extremely powerful, probably one of the strongest in all of the Fate franchise, which makes sense considering how much of a big deal Charlie is. The link to Charlemagne's lore and legend is pretty obvious. But some words about these paladins? It's actually rather vague who exactly the 12 really are. It's less a set group of 12 individuals and more a group of the 12 peers, or lords, of Charlemagne's kingdom, and so the exact roster of those 12 tends to vary. Of FGO characters, Roland is the most famous of Charlemagne's paladins, the best warrior among them, and one of the originals dating all the way back to the Song of Roland in the 11th century. Astolfo was added later on, being a notable character in the Italian poem Orlando Furioso. As for Bradamante, while she is a knight in service to Charlemagne and is one of the major characters in Orlando Furioso, it doesn't seem like she is actually one of the 12, but she might as well be. Lastly, the word paladin itself comes from Palatine, the center hill of Rome that was the site of imperial palaces starting with Augustus, the first emperor of Rome. So a paladin was a guardian of the palace, or one of the great lords surrounding the monarch. The word paladin began to appear during the 13th century, specifically referencing the 12 peers of Charlemagne, but has since come to mean any great knight or hero in service to a king, such as the Knights of the Round Table. In Fate EXTELLA LINK, Charlemagne also has another noble phantasm, Charles Patricius, a massive airborne fortress that acts as the main base throughout the course of that game. This is also an MP for the ruler Karl der Große, though it is given the name Carolus Patricius, which also turns into a giant robot. Patricius refers to the old Roman title of patrician, or a leading family of the old Roman Republic. After the fall of Western Rome, it became an honorary title given to leading families in Eastern Rome or in Italy. Charlemagne's father, Pepin the Short, would earn the title Patricius of the Romans, and Charlemagne's own efforts to fight on behalf of the Pope played a major part in his getting crowned emperor in the year 800. As for the MP being a giant base, Charlie was a major state builder, building the Carolingian Empire that, though short-lived, would have a profound impact upon European history. Charlemagne's capital was in the city of Aachen, which is literally right on the modern borders of Germany, Belgium, and the Netherlands. For the first half of its existence, emperors of the Holy Roman Empire were crowned in Aachen, though the city's significance declined from the 1500s onward. Despite this, its symbolic importance remained considerable, resulting in a bitter fight for the city during the Second World War. Captured by the Americans on the 21st of October 1944, the city suffered heavy damage, though its historic sites like Aachen Cathedral, the place where Charlemagne is buried and many other relics of his reign are kept, either managed to survive or have since been rebuilt. Charlemagne's craft essence is a king's blade, a hero's blade, depicting his sword, Joyeuse. When talking about the sword, Joyeuse, we are actually referring to two different weapons, one historical and one from the legends. Historically, Joyeuse is a sword claimed to be Charlemagne's that has been used in the coronation of French kings from 1270 to 1825. While this sword may not be the one originally wielded by Charlemagne, there are parts of the blade that could very well be from his time period. Joyeuse was stored in the Louvre in 1793 during the French Revolution, where it remains to this day. As for the mythical Joyeuse that features in Carolingian legend, it is much more than a coronation sword, being a magical blade that is said to change color 30 times a day, as well as also having a part of the Lance of Longinus in its pommel, the spear that pierced the side of Jesus while he was on the cross that is also wielded by Percival. All of these things are mentioned in the Bond CE's text, and the bit about the sword constantly changing colors is alluded to both in Charlemagne's attacks and in his MP animation, with all the different colored weapons from the 12 paladins. Suffice to say, the link this sword has to Charlemagne both historically and in legend is solid. Looking into the future, Charlie's Valentines CE is something that happened instantly, depicting the lewdest thing imaginable, hand-holding. This CE seems to be about the bonds of friendship that Charlemagne has developed, both in life and as a servant. Friendships with his 12 paladins, friendship with Hakuno Kishinami from the Fate Extraverse, and now friendship with the protagonist of FGO. While this does connect to Carolingian legend, this CE seems more about Charlie's fate depiction, since he is an all-around cool guy, the best kind of ally you would want. I'll go ahead and say that this works. He's got plenty of other stuff that links to his history or legends after all. And now for characterization, starting with a look into the history and myths surrounding Charlemagne. Well, here we are. I knew when I started doing these backstory sections that, someday, I was going to have to contend with a historical giant with so much to say about him that I'd either have to make it a stupidly long video, or to try to give the person justice in only a few paragraphs, with it being likely that I'd end up missing something despite my best efforts. And in Charlemagne's case, this is further compounded by the fact that we aren't just dealing with the historical Charlemagne, but his legends as well, literally centuries of written works. I'm going to do my best to keep the length of this as reasonable as possible, but considering who we are dealing with, chances are I'm going to gloss over some things. I would have to make a series of videos if I wanted to cover Charlemagne's story in detail. The same goes for future videos on historical giants like Alexander, Caesar, and Napoleon. Anyway, let's get to it. I'll start with the history. Charlemagne is one of those historical figures that you just can't skip. His influence is colossal. Rather than going point by point through every event of his life, I think I'll just do a general summary of events, then point out a few things that highlight just how big of an impact this guy has had upon European history. Charlemagne, or Karl as he was known during his life, was born in the year 748, the son of King Pepin the Short of the Frankish kingdom. When his father died 20 years later, the kingdom was split in two between Karl and his younger brother Charlemagne. This inheritance law, to make sure that lands were split equally between sons, while fair on paper, wasn't exactly a good idea for a kingdom, and would later be the reason Charlemagne's empire broke apart after the death of his son and successor, Louis the Pious. The two brothers, Karl and Carloman, didn't get along well, and likely would have come to blows had Carloman not suddenly died 3 years later in 771 at the age of 20, allowing Karl to inherit his brother's half of the kingdom. Despite this rather convenient timing, it has never been proven that Carloman died of anything but natural causes. Clearly Karl hired a really good assassin, or something. Now with full control of the Frankish kingdom, Karl would then undergo a seemingly endless succession of wars. Over 30 years of war against the Saxons in Germany, wars against the Muslims in Spain, wars in Italy against the Lombards, and many, many more. For pretty much his entire reign, Charlemagne's kingdom was fighting somebody. But by the time that he died in the year 814, his Frankish kingdom, now the Frankish Empire, had massively expanded, pushing deep into Germany, Italy, Spain, Bohemia, and even Hungary. Despite being constantly at war, Charlemagne's empire brought a stability to Western Europe not seen since the fall of Western Rome over 300 years before. But his empire would not outlive him for very long, thanks to that inheritance law stuff I mentioned before. Though Charlemagne ended up having only one surviving son inherit his whole empire, when that son, Louis the Pious, died in 843, the Frankish Empire was split between his 3 sons. The consequences of this split, West Francia becoming France, East Francia becoming Germany, later the Holy Roman Empire, and Middle Francia becoming lands that the other two would fight over to determine where the borders were between France and Germany, that dispute wouldn't really be resolved until 1945, over 1100 years later. A few other details about the real Charlemagne. He played a major role in the spread of Christianity throughout Western Europe, particularly due to his wars in Germany. This did lead to some ugly incidents, such as the massacre of Verdun in 782, which saw the murder of 4,500 Saxons who refused to convert. Alas, conversion by the sword was the norm for the time, both in Charlemagne's Christian empire and in the Muslim empires to the south. But because of the massive growth of his empire, Charlemagne soon came into contact with the Slavic tribes in Eastern Europe. And because he was such a dominating force, his name, Karl or some version of it, is used as the word for king in pretty much every Slavic language: Czech, Slovak, Polish, Bulgarian, Ukrainian, Russian, and many more. Charlemagne's empire building would also have profound consequences even outside of its borders. The expansion of his empire through Germany up to the southern borders of Denmark would be one of the major factors leading to the start of the Viking Age, which would also have a similarly massive impact upon the shape of Europe and the establishment of new kingdoms, notably the Norman conquest of England and the founding of the state of Rus centered on Kiev. In his private life, Charlemagne would be married 5 times and have perhaps as many as 20 children. And because of how long ago this was and because of how math works, most people with European ancestry can eventually trace their lineage back to Charlemagne. I could keep going, but I think you get the point. Charlemagne was kind of a big deal. Just a bit. And because he was such a big deal, Charlemagne became the subject of an entire genre of literature during the Middle Ages. During these times, many of the stories that were written fit into 3 genres, or the 3 matters: the matter of Britain, the matter of France, and the matter of Rome. The matter of Britain is what we now know as Arthurian legend. I don't think I need to elaborate on what this is about, not after I've done so many videos on its characters, with more coming in the future. The matter of Rome were medieval attempts to create stories out of what was known of legends from ancient Greece and Rome, such as the Trojan War, Alexander the Great, and the various myths. Though these tales tended to be full of anachronisms, portraying people like Achilles or Aeneas as being like chivalrous knights. The matter of Rome effectively died once the old myths were reintroduced back to Western Europe in the 15th century. They didn't exactly need to write new versions of the stories now that they had the originals. But it is the second of these 3 matters, the matter of France, that focused upon Charlemagne and his paladins, becoming known as Carolingian legend. I'm going to be digging more into specific episodes of Carolingian legend in future videos, particularly those of Roland, Astolfo, Bradamante, and Mandricardo. It's an incredibly expansive collection of literature, with its most famous works being the Song of Roland, the oldest surviving piece of French literature dating all the way back to the 11th century, as well as the massive Italian poem Orlando Furioso written by Ludovico Ariosto during the 16th century. There are way more works than just these two. These two are merely the most famous. Unfortunately, Carolingian legend never had someone write one big comprehensive narrative to connect all of the stories, like what Malory did with Arthurian legend. Because of that, Carolingian legend is scattered, full of contradictions, and much of it was either lost or remains untranslated. Though it was the dominant literary cycle of its day, Carolingian legend has since been overtaken in popularity by Arthurian legend, particularly in the Anglosphere. A big reason for this is that while Arthurian legend focused on characters whose historical existence can't be proven, and so people are able to write all kinds of stories and fantastical elements to fill in the gaps, Carolingian legend is about real people like Charlemagne and Roland, and so the stories will always have to compete with the real history of those figures, effectively limiting its creative potential. Unless, of course, you are willing to do crazy things like send Astolfo to the moon to recover Roland's lost sanity, putting an end to Roland's naked rampage, which is a major plotline in Orlando Furioso. No, I'm not making that up. So what exactly is Charlemagne's role in Carolingian legend? Well, he's the king at the center of it all, much like King Arthur is in Arthurian legend. But also, much like in Arthurian legend, Charlemagne doesn't actually get a lot of page time, with more time being spent on his knights like Roland, Astolfo, or Bradamante. In contrast to Arthurian legend, which is filled with magic, fairies, courtly romances, and all that other fantasy stuff, Carolingian legend is full of great battles and duels between champions, though later works like Orlando Furioso would add the magic and romance as well. Generally, the stories are about Charlemagne's Christian empire going up against non-Christian, typically Muslim foes. Charlemagne and his paladins regularly fight against massive Muslim invasions and either kill them or convert them to Christianity. It should probably come as little surprise that many of these works of literature were written during the Crusades, and so Muslims are used as the main antagonists rather than the Saxons that Charlemagne spent most of his time fighting in real life. Throughout it all, Charlemagne is portrayed as a crusader, the great hero emperor leading his knights into battle against these invaders. As for the finer details of what happens in stories like The Song of Roland or Orlando Furioso, that will be coming in future videos. Moving into the Fate franchise, we first meet Charlemagne in the game Fate EXTELLA LINK, where he is effectively the main character, both as your main ally and as the main antagonist. His ruler counterpart, Karl der Große, seeks to unite the moon cell under his control, ushering in an age of universal peace and stability. Using the tools he has available, he begins to oracleize the inhabitants of Seraph, which isn't quite like mind control since servants still have their personalities, but it does make them fight on his side. Gathering a pretty impressive cast of servants like Karna, Skahak, Francis Drake, and many more, Karl der Große attacks the remaining parts of Seraph that have yet to submit to his control. To be perfectly honest, it's actually not terribly different to what Charlemagne did in real life. He built a massive empire and waged war against non-Christian powers like the Saxons or Muslims, or those who opposed his or the Pope's authority like the Lombards. He converted these enemies to Christianity or put them to the sword, uniting the survivors under his rule. While this isn't a perfect analogy for the plot of Fate EXTELLA LINK, the actions of Charlemagne in life aren't all that different from what the ruler Karl der Große is doing in that game. But not everyone is so keen on being forced into unifying under his rule, and so a collection of servants rally together to oppose Karl der Große's efforts, including his saber counterpart. While there are some suspicions about having a younger alternate version of your main enemy as an ally, Saber Charlemagne proves to be nothing but a solid and reliable ally. Unfortunately, because he is based more on the youthful legends of Charlemagne, while Karl der Große is based upon the older emperor who had such a gigantic impact upon European history, not only is Karl der Große more powerful than his saber counterpart, Karl's defeat inevitably means the disappearance of the saber Charlemagne since they were summoned together. More than that, because ruler Karl der Große is just that much more famous than his saber counterpart, it is mentioned that it is unlikely that this saber Charlemagne can ever be summoned again. However, at the very end of the story, it is revealed that it might be possible to summon Saber Charlemagne again separate from his ruler counterpart, giving us the potential for future adventures. And while those future adventures haven't happened yet in the Extraverse, it has now become reality in FGO with the release of Traum. Because so many of his paladins were summoned and became part of the war in the Traum Singularity, Charlemagne himself has also been summoned. But much like how he was in Fate EXTELLA LINK, his power is limited, and if he unleashes it, it is only a matter of time before Charlie vanishes. His existence is just inherently unstable. Because of that, he waits for the right moment to reveal himself, going by the name of Seton when the protagonist first meets him in the Revenge Realm's prison. Seton refers to Ernest Thompson Seton, the writer of the book Wild Animals I Have Known that is the main source for the wolf Lobo, the core part of the servant Hessian Lobo. Check out my video on Hessian Lobo for more information. Nobody, not even our all-loving protagonist, actually buys this pseudonym, but we decide to leave it alone. But when the battle between the Righteous and Reinstatement realms reaches its climax, with Constantine XI and Don Quixote locked in a duel, Seton, impressed by Don Quixote's resolve, decides to intervene. Revealing himself as Charlemagne, he pushes Constantine back, ending the battle in, well, it's not quite a victory, but it's at least not a total defeat either. Alright, we'll call it a draw. Shortly afterwards, Kriemhild overruns the Reinstatement realm, and so it is up to a combined Righteous and Reinstatement realm army to fight the final battle. Charlemagne is at the forefront, effectively acting as the battlefield commander as they advance towards the Revenge Realm's capital. It is an attack against incredible odds, but honestly, that's not too different from what Charlemagne had to face in his own legends, so at the very least he's the right person for the job. As the protagonist, Kadok, and Siegfried face Kriemhild, Charlemagne and the rest hold the line against Zhang Jue until victory is achieved. Once this is done, most of the servants vanish now that the war in the Trom Singularity has been won, but Charlemagne stays, fighting one last battle against ruler Moriarty before his own power finally expires. Though he entered the fray rather late in the Singularity, Charlemagne proves to be a valuable ally, both as a leader and as a combatant. As for the future, I know that we haven't seen the last of Charlemagne just yet. At the very least, he's going to play a part in the 2026 Chaldea Boys event, where he gets himself a new costume. I'm not sure what exactly his part in this or in other future events will be, but no doubt Charlemagne will remain a stalwart ally and a good friend that you will be glad to have around, as well as being the rallying figure that keeps his paladins together despite their rather quirky personalities. And now for the verdict. What grade would I give Charlemagne's depiction in Fate Grand Order and the wider Fate franchise? Well, his character design and skill set are very solid, absolutely full of references to both history and Carolingian legend. As for characterization, his Saber counterpart focuses more upon the legends written about Charlemagne, as the good king who leads his paladins into battle against hostile invaders, while his ruler form is the great state builder, the one who sought to build an empire to fill in the vacuum left behind by the fall of Western Rome, and not always being particularly nice about it. Fate EXTELLA LINK remains Charlemagne's most important story appearance. He is both the main ally and main antagonist, after all. That entire game is effectively a clash between the history and the legend, between the unifier who built an empire and his younger idealized self who was less keen on such forceful methods. Compared to that, his appearance in the Trom Singularity is rather small, though still important. Despite that, Charlemagne ends up proving decisive in ensuring that Chaldea and the Righteous Realm emerge victorious, and even manages to stick around long enough to defeat ruler Moriarty as well. We are not done with his appearances in FGO just yet, but based upon what we have seen of him thus far, his design is solid, his skill set is solid, his storylines in Fate EXTELLA LINK and in Traum are solid, with both either directly referencing or being similar to things that Charlemagne actually did either in life or in legend. In short, Charlemagne's Fate depiction is consistently good, making him one of the better portrayed characters that we have seen thus far. And so for a final grade, I am going to give Charlemagne, also known as Karl der Große, an A. If you would like to learn more about another giant of European legend with a similar level of fame, check out my video on King Arthur here. Until next time.